This is our second webinar. We will be focusing on social differentiation in scaling. And I have introduced myself previously, but for those of you who are just joining, my name is Erin McGuire, and I'm the Associate Director of the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Horticulture. And I will pause and give my co-speaker a moment to introduce herself as well.
Hi, everyone. My name is Anne Rietveld. I work for the Alliance of Biodiversity International and CGIAR. This is a CGIAR institute. I'm based in the Netherlands. And my background is in rural sociology and farming systems. And I will be talking today about responsible scaling, and I will also give you or present a case study to illustrate a bit the issues that can occur when you're scaling an innovation.
Yeah, welcome, Anna. We're very excited to have you here. Anna and I have been working together for almost 3 years now on GenderUp specifically, through many iterations of GenderUp. So it's nice always to be able to present an almost final version together. So as Anna mentioned, we will be going over social differentiation, forms of social differentiation, intersectionality. She will highlight a case study for us from Uganda. And then I'll back it out a little bit and talk about general findings from the literature around social differentiation and the negative impacts that occur when you don't consider social differentiation. And then we'll introduce GenderUp. So just to recenter us and go over what we talked about last week. Generally, scaling theory focuses on that you can create impact through increased users of an innovation. So you have an external environment that you're trying to make impact on, and you do that through your innovation. And the way your innovation will increase its users is through a scaling process. From that scaling process, where more and more people are using your innovation, or more institutions are using your innovation, or it's become policy. There's many different scaling pathways. Your innovation ultimately will have an impact, whether it be on reducing poverty, increasing nutrition, etc. And that in turn changes the external environment. So it's circular in nature. And again, I'll highlight these different science of scaling pathways, because certainly we heard Leonard Woltering talk about them last week, and Anne will also make reference to them in her case study. And in each of these concepts, social differentiation really matters. So your scaling pathway, we heard last week, different pathways that organizations can take to scale their interventions or innovations, such as replication, adaptation, or expansion. This can include privatization or public goods. We also heard of the concept deep scaling, where you're making more institutional or cultural map for your innovation to scale. And then there's contextualization, incredibly important when we talk about social differentiation, adapting interventions or innovations to local contexts in order to ensure that they are appropriate and effective in different settings. So we will GenderUp definitely leads us through this process, but you will see it in the case study as well. And then sustainability, ensuring that scaled interventions or innovations are financially, socially, and environmentally sustainable in the long term. And your scaling pathway really plays into this. And then monitoring and evaluation, something that is always evolving within the scaling literature and practitioners of innovation and scaling, is how do we monitor whether or not we're successfully scaling. And a big part of that is whether or not your innovation is successful. How long do you spend on resources, time, energy in order for an innovation to scale? And that's part of whether or not you're failing quickly, or you really do need more time to make an innovation impactful. And that can take years, decades, etc. And then partnership and collaboration. There is very strong evidence within the literature that you must build strong partnerships and collaborations with other organizations, governments, stakeholders, in order for your innovation to spread. And then innovation diffusion is this idea of spreading of knowledge, ideas through social networks and communities, and the factors that facilitate or hinder this process. Social network theory plays into this quite a bit. And then systems thinking, making sure you're taking a holistic view of scaling and considering the broader social, economic, and political systems in which interventions or innovations are embedded. And this systems thinking is very linked to enabling environments and what is going to be an environment in which innovation can scale. And I'm sure Anne will also touch upon that as well. Finally, innovation bundling is perhaps a newer concept in its current form, but essentially it's the idea that you need to have these wraparound innovations or complementary innovations in order to scale your core innovation. So for example, when you're thinking about hybrid seeds, a new hybrid seed needs market distribution, input suppliers, perhaps training and education around how to effectively plant and harvest your new variety. So there's all these other innovations that are necessary often in order for your core innovation that you think is going to make the most impact on your social outcomes successfully scale. And just to position us before we pivot to responsible and effective scaling, we're really standing on, as I mentioned last time, responsible research and innovation, gender responsive research, and the science of scaling. And these literatures together generate this idea and concept of responsible and effective scaling. And that's what we stand on quite a bit when we think through social differentiation and possible negative consequences or prioritization of positive social outcomes within scaling. And there's a lot of background resources on the website. Hopefully one of my colleagues can pop that into the chat if you want to learn more or dive deeper into any of these concepts. So as we turn to responsible scaling, we want to think through who is benefiting and who isn't benefiting in these traditional innovation and scaling systems. So here on the left, you have a more traditional approach to scaling, where you introduce your core innovation and you let the social landscape and your traditional scaling pathway, whether it be through privatization, government programs, et cetera, do its work. What often happens is that we don't see equitable distribution of benefits for different groups of people. So those with more social capital, more financial capital, et cetera, will be more likely to be able to benefit from a new innovation. On the right-hand side is really where we're trying to go by considering these concepts of social differentiation when scaling, which we'll certainly learn more about today. So core innovation, you see the person on the left is reaping the benefits as is. You see the person in the middle needs to have all these complementary innovations that are different perhaps than the person on the left, and mitigating activities. So mitigating activities is that contextualization I mentioned earlier, where you're really adapting your core innovation and all of your wraparound complementary innovations with localized context, which considers cultural preferences, geographical preferences, et cetera. And then finally, on the right-hand side is really where we're aiming for this webinar series and course, where we are developing inclusive core innovation from the beginning in order to help this person on the right reap the benefits of innovation. And so that really considers someone's social experience at the beginning with their social outcome in mind. So if you specifically want to make headway on ethnic minority, ethnic women of childbearing age, what is it about their particular social situation that needs to change, that we need to innovate on in order to produce an outcome such as increased nutrition or reduced poverty. And just to highlight some of the negative impacts of scaling before I turn it over to Anne to give us some detailed information on what relevant diversity is and what different social identity and intersectionality can look like. Possible negative impacts from scaling that we see is that the better off benefit at the expense of the poor, which aggravates inequality and food insecurity. Women do not benefit as much as men, which aggravates gender inequality. And expansive and intensive commercial agriculture, for example, can lead to degradation of land and nature, but also intensive commercial agriculture is generally something that works for those with social capital within a community. One thing we also talk about a lot in inclusive scaling is non-users. So traditional scaling literature and practitioners might focus on the users themselves. There's a whole group of people that are affected by the innovation that are actually non-users. So with that, just to get us at the right point for Anne to begin her presentation, I will leave you with what is relevant diversity and pass it off.
Okay. So we were talking about relevant diversity, but the word relevant is quite key here, of course, because relevant to what? And I think it's important to realize that what is relevant diversity, of course, changes in relation to the innovation, because what is relevant will be different for one innovation to another, and it will also be different in one context or environment to another. So that's why it's always good when you want to scale to really look at the innovation very closely and also at the environment. So then a bit more about agricultural innovation processes. Sometimes and historically also we tend to think, or also from literature, people tend to think about scaling or adopting an innovation quite simplistically as either, it's something that happens, an individual makes a decision either to adopt or not. And by thinking about adoption like that, we sometimes admit that these innovation processes, they are relational. Often they happen as part of certain social networks, and they happen within or together with other people. And because of this, they also reflect the power and the agencies of these different people or groups that are involved. And something else which is important to realize is that when a certain innovation does go to scale, it potentially has very real implications for the ways that men and women are involved in farming. And it can really change the kinds of tasks people perform, when they perform them, how they perform them, etc. So this disruptive element or potentially disruptive element of an innovation, that is very important to consider, because that is very closely linked to possible unintended consequences. Okay. So lately we talk a lot about food systems, and I think it's, and food systems are one arena of power relations on many different scales, and we cannot deal with those power relations altogether. But it's important that we realize, or that we decide where we stand in relation to those power dynamics, and what our position is, and how we deal with power imbalances. And these imbalances can be based on different factors, for instance, based on gender or age, ethnicity, etc. I wanted to also highlight these basic definitions, because I think it's really important to have that well in mind. And I think we have a very diverse group here. So maybe not everyone has at the front of their minds what gender really refers to, because gender is not about biological sex. It's about socially constructed characteristics which are associated with being a woman, a man, a boy, or a girl, or possibly also for other categories. So it's basically about what it means in a particular context to be a woman or man, and what we consider to be appropriate behavior for a woman or man in that context. So it's about how people should behave, about the roles and the responsibilities that they have, the kind of relationships that they can have. And as I said, it's very specific to context. And when we talk about social diversity or social differentiation, this can, of course, be on basis of a lot of things. It can be, we can talk about young people versus older people. We can talk about poor people or wealthier people. It can be about sexuality, the level of education, how, but it's very important to realize that all of these categories that are mentioned here, they often also intersect with gender, and gender tends to be very important in shaping what the expectations of the norms are for people from a specific age, a specific background, ethnicity, etc., etc. So, and this is also what we look at when we talk about intersectionality. We try to understand how some of these factors come together. And it's important to realize that especially on the intersection of what Kabir calls here multiple inequalities, that is often where you find the most vulnerable people. So for instance, if in a specific society, young people don't have much power and people from a specific ethnicity are marginalized, and we are talking about a patriarchal society, then probably young women from that ethnic minority have a much more disadvantaged position than, for instance, elderly men from that ethnicity, etc. So it's important to take all these factors into account, and some of these also change during someone's life course. So agency, for instance, the ability to make decisions, often increases when people's age also increases, or when they get married, or when they have children, for instance. Okay, so yeah, I also mentioned gender norms. Very important, these prescribe what is appropriate behavior. I already said this a little bit. And what is important here is, I guess, that people do not always follow norms. They sometimes contest or flout norms, but there are social sanctions against breaking norms. This can be, for instance, that women that are not behaving appropriately, they have difficulty finding a partner for marriage, for instance, or they risk sexual violence. Okay, so this is what we already discussed in another order. So I wanted to present this case study to you, and this case study was not specifically on scaling, but I do think some of the lessons are very appropriate and insightful. And if you find this interesting, you can also read more about it, because I've also written a paper about it, which is published in the Journal of Agricultural Sustainability. And I think this case study is also an example of something which occurs much more often, in that a certain new technology increases, for instance, crop productivity, and it triggers an expansion of another kind of agriculture, basically, with a lot of side effects. And this is not something that can only be observed in this place in Uganda, but it is something that can actually be observed in many different places all over the world. Anyway, so this particular case study is about a sub-county in Isingiro district in Western Uganda, and this is a district which borders Tanzania. It's quite high, around 1,800 meters. You see a lot of hills on this picture, and it's prone to drought. And what is interesting also is that this area was only quite recently populated by people, because earlier it was considered a wild area, and there was a lot of tsetse fly, so it was not really suitable for humans living there. So this case study was about understanding change, and the change that occurred in that area, and especially in relation to the farming systems over the past few decades. And then we zoomed in specifically on gender roles and on sustainability also. Well, I will very quickly go through this. We use different methodologies, mostly participatory and qualitative. We did some mapping exercises. We tried to assess the farming system and change in the farming systems. And we conducted focus group discussions and individual interviews. And we also did a literature review, including a review of newspaper articles about the area. So the main innovation which occurred in this place was a package, actually, the innovation package, which could basically be summarized as practices for intensive banana crop management. So for those of you that know this area of a little bit, banana is often cultivated in intercrops, so intercropped with, for instance, beans or other food crops. But the idea of this innovation was that they would concede to monocropping, weeding practices changed, people would remove the suckers from banana, so that basically with the objective to get larger bunches, because these are preferred by the market. And in the environment, and this is, I will go very briefly. So what I said, this area was pretty much unpopulated before the 1960s, and then a large refugee, the first refugee camp in Africa actually was established there in 1958 or something, to cater for refugees coming from Burundi and Rwanda. And also there was a policy to promote settlement from people from other areas of Uganda there. And the government also promoted, for instance, these settlements by trying to remove the tsetse flies. Anyway, there were a lot of wars in Uganda around this time, but after '86, the situation stabilized a little bit, and this area became better connected to the roads. And also cities began growing, and there was this huge demand or growing demand for food, and especially for cooking banana, because cooking banana is the preferred staple crop for people on the south of Uganda, let's say. So that meant that traders would come from Kampala to this area to actively look for cooking banana. So there was an increase in prices and an increase in demand. And at the same time, extension services from the national government would also promote this innovation, or this package of innovation, to farmers. And the result was an intensification and expansion of cooking banana production. Well, you know, that was very successful, and a lot of people in this area benefited very much from this boom in banana production. And, you know, from our studies, it was also showed that about 20% of the community moved out of poverty over the past decade, and that also extreme poverty reduced. And you see on these photos some different kinds of houses, and people would say, for instance, you know, in the beginning, or in the, let's say in 2000, a lot of people had these houses that you can see on top with you know, made of mud bricks and not with a proper roof. But in time, they were able to construct better houses. And now you really have very large farmers there that have enormous mansions. But there were also other changes that occurred. For instance, there was a reduction in forest and trees, in grazing lands, in communal lands, and also in on-farm crop diversity, because people tended to now expand cooking banana and replace annual food crops with cooking banana. At the same time, the population increased, both through further immigration and through natural or just natural population growth. There was a better road network, and all these different services also improved, such as access to water, electricity. But there were also some landscape issues, such as increased erosion, which was, of course, associated with the reduction of forest and tree cover. When we zoom out a little bit and we look at the farming system, we see that men, because banana is culturally a man's crop in Uganda and the region, that men really focused on this crop, and they moved out of annual crop production. So they didn't do much millet production anymore, for instance. So this offered an opportunity for women to actually start producing these annual crops so that they could also make some money. But at the same time, women indicated that although there was this space now to engage in annual crop production, that at the same time, it was very difficult to access land because all land was turned into banana cultivation and was controlled by men. At the same time, women were also supposed to now work in their husbands' cooking banana plantations to do the weeding. And this weeding, which used to be done by, with a tool, a hoe, was supposed to be done by hand now to not damage the roots of the banana, which caused women a lot of backache. Other things that changed were that because of this high demand or this increased demand for labor and for management in these plantations, the labor market really changed and the demand became much higher, which also caused people from other areas of Uganda to come to this place. And there was also a problem with soil fertility, as these bunches would be exported and people would not really use would not really do anything to replace these nutrients. So just to summarize, we saw that this focus on cooking banana, which was controlled by men, led to a reduction on different, what I call here, farm enterprises. So different kinds of activities on the farm. So the converse of diversification, let's say. Because of this, women had less on-farm opportunities and control. Men enjoyed increased income overall, and some men really used this to invest in their household and to benefit their households. But what was probably a little bit unexpected was that many men also used this increased income to marry second or third wives and to invest in these households. And we got a lot of complaints from women saying that because of this, they were actually being marginalized, and that that these resources now had to be spread amongst more household members, because families also tend to be big in this area with many children. So they were actually worse off, and they would also again have less access to land, because the land that a man has had now to be distributed amongst more wives. There was also a problem with food security nutrition, because of course on-farm diversity decreased. There was less access to fresh food and reduced dietary diversity. And there was also an increasing problem with accessing firewood for food preparation. Poor women would say that they would resort to eating food that required less cooking time, such as, instead of preparing beans, for instance, which are a common food item but have a long cooking time, they would now, for instance, eat more banana or horse. And it was also more and more difficult to keep livestock at the farm. Of different bylaws that were installed by local government to avoid livestock ruining banana, but also because there was no land available anymore. And this, of course, also had an implication for soil fertility. Anyway, I know this is actually a lot, but just to give one more example about soil fertility management. So part of that innovation package was also integrated soil fertility management. And on this photo, you see what a properly managed banana plantation in this area should look like. It is mulched, and around every banana you see a circle, and well, you can't really see that, but there's also manure spread out. But when we see which farmers are actually able to do that, we see that only the very large farmers have the capacity or the resources to actually maintain their plantation like that. And the smaller farms that have less resources, they don't have they are not unable to maintain cell fertility and to bring in the amounts of manure that are needed for this. And we see that that these people are more and more resorting to work as laborer on these larger farms, because their own land is either too small to really maintain them, or it is losing fertility. So banana production is also decreasing. So this is also more or less summarizing what we have seen, that there is this pathway to economic prosperity through a focus on cooking banana, but there are also all these related issues, and I will not mention them all again, but basically there's a high risk of people that are unable to maintain their soil fertility and to also buy, for instance, food from outside, to fall into poverty, especially in a situation of crisis. And for instance, in this area, which is very prone to drought, as I said in the beginning, droughts are occurring more and more often also with climate change. And in 2017, there was a huge famine in this, 2019, sorry, there was a famine in this area. And a lot of these small farmers, they were also obliged to sell their land even, or to move away to find food. So you could really see that, that this was an unstable production. So this is a very, or quite depressing story, I always think, although the government really supports this still as a success story. And I guess for some people it is a success story, but it is not attainable to the majority of farmers. So what would a sustainable development look like in this area? Well, I don't immediately have the answers to that, but I think it's really important that when we think about development, that we don't focus only on the economic dimensions, which has often been done in this area, but we also include environmental and communal values. And secondly, it is really important to focus on these more marginalized actors and to get their perspective, because often when you hear their stories, you get a better idea of the food system and the interlinkages, rather than when you talk to these model farmers or success farmers that have succeeded in doing all these great things, because they will not tell you about, the challenges or the why they are unable to do something. And I think this links in very much to GenderUp, which Aaron will discuss in a bit. It is really important to have this understanding of the circumstances in which a problem is embedded, but also in which you would like to, or you think that you want to scale a certain innovation. So I think that was it for me.
Before you sign off, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions that came in from the chat.
Okay. No, I will not sign off immediately. I will stay online.
Oh yeah, no, good. Thank you. If it's okay, I'll just interrupt quickly so you can address these.
Yeah, no, but that's fine. I've opened the chats now.
Oh, great. So the first one, which this is a good question about, maybe something besides monocropping could have been better for these marginalized populations. But the question is, why monocropping with the well-known environmental and economic consequences?
Mm-hmm.
Was it being promoted? Could banana production been promoted without the monocropping?
Of course, you can also improve your banana production without monocropping, but in order to get the highest production and the largest bunches, for instance, because in Uganda, the market is in such a way that the larger your bunch of banana, the higher the price. So it's not per kg. This becomes, if you want a larger bunch, then you have to reduce competition for light and for nutrients. So intercropping will always compromise the size of your bunch. So that is a very clear answer, I think, why monocropping was developed. And also the kind of money that farmers were able to get from these very large banana bunches was incomparable to the revenues that they would get from other crops. And then some of these crops were, of course, food crops. But there was a very strong economic incentive also for farmers themselves to really, optimize banana production. But interestingly, after this famine that I mentioned, there is now a new bylaw, so that is like a local regulation that prescribes farmers that they have to, around the borders of their land, they have to grow food crops now, which is still quite minimal, but it shows that, people do realize that it's a problem that they stopped growing these food crops.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I'll just highlight one more question, and then there's just a third question. Maybe you can answer in the chat while I start my presentation. What are the possible mitigation measures to prevent the successful propagation, scaling of a technology innovation from falling into a negative feedback loop, as you mentioned?
Yeah, well,
extensive expansion, monocropping, etc.
Yeah, no, that's a very relevant question, and also a very huge question, of course. But I think, you mentioned system thinking in the beginning, and I think it's very important to realize that these innovations, especially when they actually do go to scale, they interlink with other trends that are going on. For instance, with a growing demand for a certain crop, or, whatever. And then it comes to a certain point that it is also, that you as an organization or whatever, you don't have that control, right? There is no control. But so that control is maybe with the system. And there are, of course, a lot of food system approaches that try to regulate some of these things. But I think something which is very important, and which I also mentioned here, is that indeed, we don't only focus on those economic values, and we do keep our eyes open for these other issues. In this area, if people would have paid a little bit more attention, maybe they would have seen what was happening, and people are also seeing it. But it's like no one wants to miss the train of making money, but at the same time people are aware of it. So it is really a difficult situation, but it's also about differentiating, I think, and about saying, okay, this way of, for instance, maintaining your soil fertility is really suitable when you have a lot of land and a lot of resources, but for farmers that don't have that, maybe you should try this or that. So it's also about not giving people the idea that this, you could almost call it a dream of, getting rich through producing banana, is attainable to everyone, because it's actually not. But that is what people believed for some time.
Thank you. Yeah, very much, Anna. That was a wonderful case study that really helped highlight, I think, some of our concepts.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So, and feel free to jump in, Anna, as I describe. Anna and I also published this paper, which highlights a lot of these types of case studies. We did an analysis of many scaling examples where things went wrong because people, researchers and scaling practitioners didn't consider social differentiation at the beginning. So thinking about Anna's example, we are now going to show or highlight what was found within the literature more broadly. And this really acted as the foundation for us to begin to operationalize these learnings to create GenderUp, which we'll explain in a moment, so that practitioners and researchers can systematically draw upon the lessons from the literature within their own scaling projects. And this is the paper, Anticipating Gender Impacts in Scaling and Innovations for Agriculture, Insights from the Literature. So findings from the literature, one is around your teams, comprising research and project teams, around designing your innovation, which certainly we will talk quite a bit about in the upcoming webinar series, which really focuses on innovation systems and how we design innovations with social differentiation in mind, around communication and how we talk about and provide information on new innovation, scale models, how we choose scale models, entrepreneurship and business development, particularly, how these power dynamics play out in the field in terms of reinventing and changing innovation. Once an innovation is put out into a landscape, it doesn't stay the same. It can change. Different people have different power over it. And often it ends up serving those that are in power. And then finally, enabling, engaging with the political economy of innovation and how we need to think about the enabling environment when we're scaling with social differentiation in mind. So just to dive a little bit deeper into each of these topics, when we're comprising research and project teams, one of, I think, the unique aspects of gender responsive research and scaling and responsible and effective scaling is that we consider our own research teams. Sexism, racism, power dynamics do not just begin in the field, they begin within our own research teams. And to that effect, gender and power biases are systematic and prevalent throughout the innovation and scaling systems. We often see that men assume positions of power. We also know from the literature that women and non-white men are less likely to have their contributions taken up, even though they innovate at similar or greater rates compared to white male counterparts. And strong diversified innovation pipelines lead to more effective innovation. So these two concepts are really at odds to one another. We want successful innovation and scaling of innovation. However, we really handicap ourselves when we think about who is innovating and the types of solutions we're including. We know that more diverse pipelines lead to more effective innovation, and we need to build our innovation teams to support that. And a big part of this paper is the anticipatory questions. So it's meant to be read by practitioners and researchers really doing this work, so they themselves can start thinking about how to apply the findings from the literature. So anticipatory questions on this topic is: who's leading the project? How does positionality impact decision-making? And what capacity strengthening is needed to ensure team members are aware of their limitations and contribute equitably? Also, designing agricultural innovations for women. Innovation design, in theory, should decrease burden and be culturally appropriate for women and other marginalized populations. Often, however, innovations are designed for non-disabled men, and so they end up supporting those social groups within the community. This is an example, and I think Anna also provided some examples on storage of sweet potatoes in Malawi, I believe. Yeah. So there's two different types of innovations. One was a pit storage, a much simpler innovation, and the other was a hut that needed to be built and needed to have man's assistance. And ultimately, the women really wanted the pit storage, even though it was simpler in nature, because they needed their husbands' help build the hut. It resulted in them losing ownership of the sweet potatoes kept in the hut. And when they were able to manage the pit themselves, it increased their confidence. And that really leads to inter-household power relations and thinking through something which might seem so removed from whether or not your scaling team wants to scale a hut or a pit, but it's something that really made a difference in the social outcomes in this community. So we'll be talking a lot about innovating specifically for certain populations. And then your scale models also really matter. So once you have the innovation, that's really 10% of the battle often. You don't really have a solution unless you can scale it. And so we're constantly working on different scale models, and the type of scale model will benefit different people differently. For instance, business models that incorporate innovations might not be profitable for women or other marginalized groups, even if they are for community members with access to social and financial resources. We know that we often need capital in order to start businesses, for example. So some questions to ask yourself: does the focus group have the necessary business acumen for market access? Do they have access to complementary inputs or systems to use and sell the innovation? Does it depend on accessing credit? And I should say all of these considerations are driving toward whether or not someone's going to benefit from the innovation. So these are variables that come into play that could cause someone to actually experience harm from an innovation or benefit. Communication and extension of innovations. This is a really big one because we always need to talk about an innovation for someone to be able to use it. Extension services and information tend to be biased toward men. It frequently neglects disadvantaged social groups such as the extremely poor, landless, youth, and women. And information does not trickle down from the husband to other household members. So often you might get a group of farmers together that are mostly men, and the project may assume that information is going to disseminate throughout the community, but it often doesn't occur that way. Also, women prefer and trust different sources of information, as well as their social networks differ. And on top of that, in some communities, it's just not appropriate for men extension workers to be communicating with women. So that is just a no-go when you're trying to scale your innovation through a government extension system, in some communities, of course. Reinventing and changing technology, as I mentioned before, this really roots back to power dynamics. And within the literature, there's an increased focus on how innovations change within the system it operates. It's not just a binary choice of adoption or not. It's often changing depending on who has control over the innovation. For example, you might have an innovation that is introduced specifically for women to use. For instance, I work a lot in horticulture and fruits and vegetables, which is traditionally a woman's crop. But once that intervention, which let's say is growing fruits and vegetables of some sort, starts to increase income, often the control of that intervention will be taken over by those in the household with more social power. So asking yourself, how will this innovation be reinvented after introduction in the field? Will the focus group have access and input to the reinvention? How will groups or individuals impact future iterations? And finally, engaging with the political economy of innovation. So enabling and conditions include the political economy and can include all-encompassing economic and social institutions. Significant paradigm shifts are necessary to address systemic issues within institutions that often underscore the power of already powerful actors. And so partnership is critical to enable a dynamic scaling path, particularly when there are different levels of expertise, political connections, and positionality. One of the things that can be most challenging for an innovation or scaling team to take on is the political economy and enabling environment. But it's, for instance, sexism within a community is not necessarily within the scope of a biophysical innovation scaling team. And those are really difficult systemic barriers to overcome. So you really have to think through, how is it that you cannot play into and underscore the systems of inequity that are already in place, while also having it be an appropriate intervention. So really understanding what the limitations are within the community before introducing an innovation that might just go nowhere because of the political or legal landscape. So anticipatory questions: is there a policy or social norm that somehow excludes access to the innovation, complementary inputs, or systems necessary to exchange and interact with the intervention? And so those were the major findings from the paper, and we were really able to pivot from these literature findings to consider practical application. So now we're going to talk a little bit about GenderUp, which is based on this idea that different innovation packages are going to be experienced differently by women and men. On the left-hand side, you can see an XY axis. On the X is innovation readiness. On the Y is innovation use. So how much is an innovation already being used? This is a graph from Scaling Readiness, which helps people understand how ready an innovation package is to scale. And this is really just highlighting on the right-hand side that for each of these innovations in the left-hand graph, their use and their readiness to be used is different for different groups of people, which I've highlighted here. And so you really have to think about responsible scaling throughout the scaling process. This is a linear version, and as everyone who has spoken has highlighted, scaling is not a linear process. But I'm really laying out here that from the challenge / opportunity to the innovation that we suggest, and then all of the scaling decisions we make around complementary innovations, communication and media, partnerships, et cetera, and the implementation of that, and even the scaling goal. What are we trying to do? Is it to increase incomes for a community, or is it trying to increase incomes for marginalized populations? And every single place along that decision path, we can choose to consider social differentiation or not. And that's why we developed GenderUp. I'm going to spend just a couple minutes introducing this concept, and then I'll open it up for questions. I know that we're hitting the hour mark, and for those of us in the class, we'll just stay on and do Q&A, and we hope that others are able to stay on as well if you have a burning question. Of course, if you have a question and Anna or anyone from the team can answer it in the chat box, I welcome that. So GenderUp, how do we mainstream considering different groups of people when scaling innovations? This is a collaboration between Wageningen University and Research, the Alliance of Biodiversity International and CGIAR, Institute for Tropical Agriculture, and with the University of California, Davis as a scaling partner. We started working on this because there was a recognition that there was a gap in the scaling tools available. And generally the tools available were focused on bottlenecks in the scaling process, such as whether or not there were appropriate partnerships, business interests, or inputs available. And with USAID and the Sustainable Development Goals focus on gender, youth, and equity, there seemed to be a component that was missing from these discussions. So as I mentioned, this work started 3 years ago. GenderUp engages and is built for innovation teams who have an agricultural innovation ready to scale. And its overall goal is for more successful and inclusive scaling of agriculture innovations. And it improves the scaling strategy by optimizing inclusion of relevant social groups and anticipating unintended negative consequences. So as you can see here, to assist in avoiding, these are the 5 stages of GenderUp. We move from the very beginning of defining the innovation and scaling ambition with an innovation team. So this is all facilitated with an innovation team, as I mentioned, that has an agriculture innovation. We move through a series of 5 stages that includes activities, discussions, and debriefs to best prepare to avoid unintended consequences and then develop an innovation for a certain social group and successfully scale certain social outcomes. GenderUp uses facilitated team discussions with Miro boards, which I'll show you a little example of, individual surveys and videos, and presentations on team dynamics, gender and agriculture, intersectionality, and mitigating activities to increase capacity for gender awareness and scaling. So you are welcome to look at these slides a bit later. I'll finish by saying the GenderUp journey during COVID, we did it over 3 workshops, which each took 3 hours, and it's usually completed within a period of 3 to 6 weeks. Like I said, the structure is a pause and learn, team reflection, and guided discussion in plenary and breakout groups. And I would say, and the team is generally 3 to 8 people and preferably diverse in disciplinary background. And this is also shown to be a really incredible learning experience, especially for those who aren't familiar with gender and other social differentiation issues, as well as being effective in creating more inclusive scaling strategies. And just some snapshots. This is a pause and learn. This is what our team discussions look like on Miro board. This is stage 2, which is understanding relevant diversity, where we think through what is needed in order to use the innovation and who has access to what is needed. So for instance, here, what is needed is financial resources, land, market linkages. And then we start thinking through who has access to this. What do you need? You need wealth status, education, certain ethnicities have better access than others. And then we start to talk through understanding implications of intersectionality. So we've identified ethnicity, wealth, and education as important elements of diversity to accessing resources needed to use the innovation. And then we start to think through what are the segments of that relevant diversity that's most at risk. So in wealth, it's usually low income segments of that diversity that are most at risk. And then we cross that with what is the experience for low income women? Are they more or less disadvantaged in accessing these resources? And finally, we talk about what are the negative or positive consequences as a result of this? How might they be limited in accessing the innovation's benefit? And finally, we come together to develop a more inclusive scaling strategy, considering the limitations or the opportunities in these very specific social groups. And with that, it concludes GenderUp, where we have operationalized essentially the learnings from the literature. And you can see how important this is when you look at a case study like Anna presented with really well-intentioned researchers and scaling practitioners. But there's all these unintended consequences that it can occur. And we've really tried our best to create the GenderUp tool that responds to these issues, to systematically think through social differentiation and scaling. And I will just end by saying this is where we want to head as a webinar series or as a class, where we want to think through innovating itself for social differentiation. So in the same way we've taken scaling concepts, social differentiation, and created a tool that researchers can use to systematically include gender and scaling, we want to do the same thing with innovating. And that is why the next 2 webinar series will focus on agriculture innovation systems, social differentiation within innovation systems, who has access and who doesn't, and then ultimately how we can operationalize some of the concepts that we know from the literature. So thank you very much, and I will open it for questions now.
There's one question. If, and we've had this question before actually, if a GenderUp analysis can lead to totally discarding a certain innovation. And I think the answer is yes, but it depends, of course, on the context. So indeed, maybe in a certain context, doing a GenderUp analysis can, result in the conclusion that something that it's not sustainable or recommendable to scale that innovation. But maybe in another context, this will be very different. So, there's still, it's not necessarily completely. And you can also adjust the innovation, perhaps, depending on what it is. So, yeah, totally discarding, but I mean, yeah, depending on what it is, you can still maybe, it's maybe not totally discarding.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have started to see GenderUp used as an innovation curation mechanism. It's really just starting. We're just starting to have conversations with people who already have, stage gating in place, and where you have essentially a database of technology and how you decide to curate and choose technologies to apply in different situations. That's certainly something that should be mainstreamed more, is social differentiation in these innovation databases, whether at the CG, USAID, et cetera. But the earlier you think about GenderUp and social differentiation, which is why I think it's also really important to innovate specifically for social differentiation, you can also help to redirect your resources into an innovation that might be more useful. And it's just human nature, I think, in many research teams to want to promote your innovation for as long as you can. You always see the value in it. And so it can be harder the further down you get in an innovation and scaling process to redirect your research team, I think.
And
go ahead.
That links nicely to the next question from Giang, who is asking, how can you incorporate social differentiation effectively, especially in a context when you have limited resource and time? And indeed, I think, the earlier, as exactly what Erin was saying, the earlier you do actually consider social differentiation, the less time it also costs, right? Because then it just becomes an integral part of your project, and it becomes, it will always cost a little bit of time, but you can also save time. So integrate it from the beginning, I would say, is the answer there. And then there was another question from Eva. If there are any recommendations of types of gender approaches to take for next steps following your analysis. Okay, yeah, so basically after doing the GenderUp analysis, of course, there are many, the answer can be anything, I guess. She's thinking of stakeholder engagement letter, for example, to increase the engagement of the different relevant groups for your innovation. Well, one of the things that we also do in GenderUp is actually to think about ways to mitigate, so to actually avoid or work around certain challenges, and that can be through coming up with a complementary innovation, and that is, for instance, organizing a training, for instance, or it can be, ranging from something very simple to something very lengthy and difficult, I guess. And as I said on your earlier question in the chat, it can also be that you would want to implement, that you, for instance, find that there are really certain normative constraints, and you have to maybe address those norms, and that is, of course, a very lengthy process. But well, I thought there was this nice example of a project from GIZ. They were promoting mechanization, or the use of tractors in Ghana, I think, and they, well, as often the case in everywhere in the world, I think, using tractors or heavy machinery is more associated with men and is often considered inappropriate for women. So then, promoting these tractors basically, excludes women from this part of the agricultural process, right? So what they did is organize special trainings for tractor driving for women, and really promoting this as something that modern, young, new women do. And well, I don't know if it was successful. I only know that they did that training. But that could be a way to try to change those ideas about what is appropriate or inappropriate. So that's a short example, but there are many more possibilities, of course.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, there is a slide I often show, which I'll include in the presentation that we post, which shows all the different examples of how we have generated more inclusive scaling strategies through GenderUp. So for instance, like Anna said, if women are going to have a difficult time getting to training, then the scaling strategies changed so that the training happens by women in the communities that they live in, that there's food or childcare provided, and just getting people to think about what is it that will actually give them access to the resources and inputs necessary in order to benefit from the innovation. And so if you need education or training to benefit from the innovation, how is it that we can make that training more accommodating for this group of people? Same thing with access to financial resources. How do we do inclusive capital? How do we increase women's savings groups, et cetera? There's a plethora of tools out there that we can think through, as long as we know what the relevant diversity is and what the possible consequences or unequal distribution of benefits will be if they don't get access to these certain leverage points or critical resources.
Thank you. I think the next question is also interesting. It's about, saying usually when people want to scale a successful pilot, taking a holistic approach where we address sexism and racism, which are deeply rooted social issues, it's often considered as a roadblock and, as slowing down the development process. And to what degree should an organization prioritize inclusivity over general growth or development? Is it all or nothing, or multiple interlinked solutions can be implemented in a progressive pattern? Well, I think, there's not really one answer to this question, because it really depends, of course, on, the actors involved in that development process and the actors with power in that development process, if they think, inclusivity is important, yes or no. I guess you always can just not consider it, but development for whom, would I then ask? I mean, for instance, in the case study I presented, there was clearly economic progress overall, like the overall poverty in that area reduced. But at the same time, you see this, all these interlinked negative processes, then including, people being excluded from that economic development. So is that then, is that sustainable, for instance? I don't think so. So I think, it's not an all or nothing ideology. I just think that it's important to think about inclusivity also as something which actually promotes sustainability. Well, if you don't value being inclusive or contributing to gender equity as a goal in itself, then at least maybe value it as contributing to sustainability.
Well, and I would add to that, I really like to center I begin many of these talks by saying we're striving for sustainable development goals. We're striving for USAID goals. We're striving for CGIAR goals. Every single one of those large platforms has gender, youth, poverty reduction for marginalized populations front and center to the work that we're doing. So it's critical, really, in my opinion, that if we're trying to move the needle on that front, we consider social differentiation when generating these innovations and interventions that are supposed to be moving the needle on those fronts. And it's really, in my opinion, it is more complicated. But what's the purpose of doing all of these activities if we're actually working our way out, like if we're contributing to our anti-goals, which is increased marginalization, increased inequity, et cetera. So I think just having more of a social science perspective within biophysical teams can really contribute just a bit to starting to see these social goals realized within biophysical interventions. Okay.
We have a few more questions. I will first read out the one from Irene, who's asking, how does the management and monitoring of socially differentiated innovations work, and how can the target community manage when the leading figure that set the stage for innovation leaves? And I think this is an interesting question. The second part of your question implies that it is like one person or one organization that is setting the stage. And I can understand that you say that, because even the way that we present, I present, I often talk about you, or, in the first person. But I do think that these kind of innovation processes are most successful when they are done in a more participatory fashion. So together with farmers and supported by local action, and ideally also led by local participants and stakeholders. And I see our role as like research for development organizations more in supporting these innovation processes, or maybe facilitating them, than in leading them. And well, I mean, clearly also in my own organization, not everyone thinks like that. And the more traditional way of thinking about this is indeed, that we or extension services tell a farmer, oh, you should do this, and, everything will be great. But we are moving away from that mode of working, I think, and we should also. So then even the monitoring could also be done together with the community, and there are a lot of tools, participatory approaches to do that. And then Giang asked again, or is that okay? Is that okay for now, Erin? Can I continue to the other one, or do you want to say something about this?
No, go ahead.
Okay. How would you evaluate the readiness of GenderUp for scaling? And that's also an interesting question. We actually just discussed that with our little GenderUp team yesterday. And I said, I feel that we are 90% there, but not fully. We are ready to go to scale. I don't know, it's up for discussion. I think we still need to do some things. We would like to use, or people to use GenderUp in more different contexts, so that we can also learn from the users. It has been used a few times, but it would be better if it's used a few more times, and also in different contexts, etc. And then we still want to make some improvements to the website, but it is usable. And we are actually hoping to get some more, and we are also planning to actually actively look for some more funding to just make it a better product, I guess, right? I'm sure Erin would like to add something to this.
I think that's well said. Yeah, I mean, it's something that is of interest to many large organizations. And I think to many individuals, as well as more social scientists, want a mechanism to introduce social differentiation, scaling, et cetera, to other people in their team. I would say the bottleneck right now is, definitely getting more GenderUp trainers. So if anyone's interested in being a GenderUp trainer, let us know. Yeah, no, that is very true. Because as Erin also briefly mentioned, we do need a facilitator to go through the process. And of course, you need some training to be able to do that. And if we get a lot of demand now, we have jobs. We ideally would have like a pool of consultants that can do this. So, let us know if you're interested in becoming one. Are there other questions? Feel free to unmute yourself and speak as well. You're welcome to add a comment, of course, too. I think I had all the other questions, right? Can the innovation be the promotion or strengthening of traditional practices or arrangements, like native foods to improve food security and sovereignty, or communal forests that provide resources for the community in a more equitable manner? So yeah, I mean, this goes to the innovation literature, but I would say yes. It's really, when I think about innovation, it's certainly social practices as well as technological practices. And it has to do with an intervention really that you're trying to scale. But Anne and I might have a difference of opinion here. No, I agree. I think it's definitely possible, and maybe also very interesting, especially when you're talking about traditional
what was it? Sorry, I clicked away. Traditional practices or arrangement. I think it's very relevant to actually look at inclusivity and who benefits and who doesn't. And it doesn't matter, I think, if it is an innovation coming from outside or from inside a community. No, it doesn't matter. You can do it for both. Can also be led by a community, GenderUp, or like, you know, a community. I mean, the way that we tested GenderUp, it was mostly done, or, you know, the people that did GenderUp went on the GenderUp journey. They were, you know, researchers or professionals wanting to skill something. But it can also be a community that is maybe thinking of investing in something, whatever it may be, and wanting to know who can potentially benefit from that. So it's also interesting for local policymakers, or even just from for collective action groups or whatever, you know, for community support groups. I mean, we haven't tested it in that context, but I do think it would be possible, and there would also be potentially an added value, of course.
Yeah, I'll make sure to post our GenderUp training of the trainers as soon as there is one. And then, of course, there's also just the GenderUp facilitated experience as well, where we just workshop and innovation. And that's what Sophie Javers, who commented in the chat, she'll be doing with her team in Malawi soon, is running just a straight up GenderUp workshop, which will be really interesting to know how it goes.
Thank you all. Have a great evening or day.
All right. Thanks all so much. We'll see some of you in just a moment on the other Zoom link. Others, hopefully we'll see you next time for an introduction to agriculture innovation systems and who is included and who isn't. All right. Thanks so much.